2 years ago, Arthur's theme was a huge hit, and its singer, Christopher Cross, a 5-time Grammy winner for his first album, was pretty big himself. Cross, 32, has since shed 50 pounds, and with it, a great deal of the pressure he felt to produce another blockbuster, a blockbuster that never came.
One of the biggest stars in music vanished almost as quickly as he arrived. In 1981, Christopher Cross achieved something almost nobody in Grammy history had ever done, sweeping all 4 major categories in a single night and beating some of the biggest names in the industry. He looked untouchable. Then, almost overnight, everything changed, and the man who had just dominated the Grammy Awards found himself pushed to the sidelines while others took his place.
Our spotlight today is on music, and we'll begin with a fellow who didn't get lost between the moon and New York City, Christopher Cross. Chris and his music both have a new look, and Catherine Mann has the details.
So how did one of the most successful artists of his generation go from making history to becoming one of music's most misunderstood stories? Join us as we uncover what really happened to Christopher Cross, the kid from San Antonio. Christopher Cross was just a kid who grew up in Texas with a guitar in his hands and absolutely no idea what was waiting for him. He described himself as an Army brat, the son of a United States Army pediatrician who had been stationed at Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. during the mid-1980s, where his father served as a physician for President Dwight Eisenhower's grandchildren. He met bassist Andy Salmon and keyboardist Rob Murer while still a teenager in San Antonio. Geppert and Salmon became bandmates in a group called Flash, with Geppert playing guitar. His guitar playing was genuinely serious, not just a hobby he dabbled in before turning to songwriting. In 1970, he actually substituted for Ritchie Blackmore during a Deep Purple concert after Blackmore fell ill, a wild detail most casual fans of his soft rock hits have never heard. His guitar skills connected him, almost accidentally, to one of the most important figures in the history of Texas blues. In 1974, Christopher traded in a Stratocaster at a local Austin guitar shop for a Gibson Les Paul. The very next day, a young broke musician named Stevie Ray Vaughan walked into that same shop and bought the exact guitar Cross had just traded away. That instrument became known as Number 1, the guitar that would define Vaughan's entire career and become one of the most famous Stratocasters in rock history. Christopher Cross, without realizing it at the time, had unknowingly handed off a piece of guitar history to one of the greatest blues players who ever lived. Christopher eventually realized his real passion lay in songwriting rather than performing as a hard rock guitarist. In the mid-1970s, he joined an Austin-based top 40 cover band, playing covers for Cash at Night while quietly writing his own original material. The band, which considered itself a genuine group effort, recorded demo versions of its original songs at Austin's Odyssey Sound, later renamed Pecan Street Studio, and shipped the tapes to record labels across the country, hoping someone would take notice. Someone did take notice, but the deal that finally arrived came with a catch that none of them saw coming. So what happened when Warner Brothers Records finally called, and why did the news come as a genuine shock to the band that had worked together for years? The solo deal nobody in the band expected. Although the group genuinely considered themselves a band, Warner Brothers signed Christopher Cross as a solo artist in early 1979. For a group of musicians who had spent years grinding through demo tapes and bar gigs together as a unit, discovering that the label only wanted the frontman, not the band, was a complicated and bittersweet moment. Christopher and his bandmates had been hoping for nothing more than a moderate hit when they moved from Austin to Los Angeles in 1979 to record their self-titled album. In his own words, they were simply hoping to maybe have a moderate hit, just enough to keep making records. Nobody involved in that recording session was dreaming about sweeping the Grammys. they just wanted a career. Christopher released his self-titled debut album on December 27, 1979. What came out of those sessions was a remarkably polished, melodically rich collection of soft rock songs that would go on to become one of the defining sounds of early 1980s adult contemporary radio. The album climbed to number 6 on the Billboard 200 Albums chart, a genuinely strong commercial, showing for a debut from a virtually unknown songwriter out of Austin. But the hopeful expectations that Christopher and his bandmates had carried into those Los Angeles recording sessions were about to be blown apart entirely, in a way that none of them, in their most optimistic moments, could have possibly predicted. So what actually happened when the Grammy nominations came out, and just how completely did Christopher Cross dominate the biggest night in the music industry? The night he beat Pink Floyd and Frank Sinatra in the same breath. At the 1981 Grammy Awards, Christopher Cross did something that had genuinely never been done before in the history of the ceremony. He won Album of the Year for Christopher Cross. He won Record of the Year for Sailing. He won Song of the Year for Sailing. And he won Best New Artist, sweeping all 4 of the major categories in a single night. The achievement became known simply as the Big Four, and its scale was almost unbelievable. Nobody else managed to repeat that exact feat until Billie Eilish accomplished it nearly 4 decades later. Sailing alone earned 3 Grammys that night: Record of the Year, Song of the Year, and Best Instrumental Arrangement accompanying vocalist or vocalists. The song reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, a soft, dreamy ballad about escaping the noise of ordinary life that connected with an enormous audience tired of the chainsaw radio and punk that had dominated the previous several years. Christopher has talked about exactly what audiences were craving at that specific cultural moment, explaining that before he came along, there had been disco, then a lot of chainsaw radio and punk, and that people of the age group buying his records were a little tired of all of that, and were saying they would sure like to hear a song now and then. His music landed at precisely the right cultural moment, offering something gentle and melodic when the prevailing sounds on the radio had become increasingly aggressive. But the specific competition he beat that night carried its own weight, and the choice of winner did not sit well with everyone watching. The Album of the Year competition that year included Pink Floyd's The Wall, one of the most acclaimed and ambitious rock albums ever recorded, and Cross's win over it was viewed by some music critics as a genuine indignity for the prog rock genre. Sailing's win for Record of the Year also came at the direct expense of Frank Sinatra's New York, New York, a song that had already become a cultural institution. The very next year, Christopher Cross's career somehow climbed even higher, this time onto the global stage of cinema itself. In 1981, he co-wrote Arthur's Theme, also known as Best That You Can Do, with Burt Bacharach, Carol Bayer Sager, and Peter Allen for the Dudley Moore film Arthur. The song peaked at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and won the 1982 Academy Award for Best Original Song. Christopher Cross was now, simultaneously, a multi-Grammy winner and an Oscar winner, a level of recognition that almost no songwriter of his generation could match. He had reached, in less than 2 years, the absolute summit of what the American music industry had to offer. And then, almost exactly when MTV launched, everything he had built started quietly collapsing underneath him. So what actually happened the moment that channel hit the airwaves, and why did it become such a problem for him specifically? The channel that changed everything overnight. On August 1st, 1981, a brand new cable channel called MTV went live, and the music industry's entire relationship with its artists changed almost instantly. MTV grew rapidly to dominate the mainstream music scene in the United States, and Christopher Cross's musical style proved to be a fundamentally poor fit for the network. His brand of soft, adult contemporary music declined sharply in popularity, as the channel reshaped what success in the music business actually required. What MTV demanded, almost overnight, was a visual product, a face, a look, a physical presence that could carry a song the same way the song itself once carried an artist on the radio alone. Suddenly, being a brilliant songwriter and a talented vocalist was no longer sufficient on its own. You needed to look the part too, and the part being defined by this new channel skewed heavily toward conventionally photogenic, often younger, often more conventionally attractive performers. Christopher was a chubby and goateed singer who probably wasn't anybody's idea of a pin-up. Many music historians and writers have pointed directly to Christopher Cross as the single artist most impacted by the MTV generation, specifically identifying him as the textbook example used whenever people discuss MTV's reshaping of who got to succeed in popular music. With the music video craze in full swing, his appearance was largely blamed for the abrupt downturn in his career at the time. The man who had just swept the Grammys, who had just won an Academy Award, who had been one of the most decorated new artists in the history of American music, was suddenly being discussed in terms of whether he looked the part rather than whether his songs were good. He did manage to eke out one more top 10 hit, Think of Laura, before the slide became unmistakable. That song cracked the American top 10 pop radio charts at number 9 in early 1984 and peaked at number 1 on the adult contemporary radio chart. It was a genuine success, proof that audiences who actually listened to the radio still wanted what he was offering. But it was also, in many ways, the last gasp of his mainstream commercial relevance before the bottom fell out almost completely. So was MTV really the single force that destroyed Christopher Cross's career, or was something even bigger working against him at the exact same time? The uncomfortable truth that MTV was not acting alone. Here is where the story gets more interesting than the simple version that gets repeated most often. It is worth noting that Phil Collins, a balding, perpetually middle-aged-looking progressive rock drummer turned solo artist, was certainly no traditional pin-up either. And yet, that did not stop him from becoming one of MTV's biggest stars during this exact same period. And there was the case of the band Boston, arguably one of the most faceless acts of the era, who in 1986 topped the charts with their album Third Stage, despite an 8-year absence from the public eye and the fact that they had produced no music videos at all. If appearance alone determined who survived the MTV era, Phil Collins and Boston should have struggled exactly as much as Christopher Cross did. They did not. Something else was clearly going on beneath the surface of the simple narrative. Christopher had been a central figure in adult contemporary and soft rock music in the early 1980s, and the cultural relevance of those exact genres faded considerably as the decade progressed. Soft rock had dominated American radio throughout the 1970s, particularly during the latter half of that decade, arguably reaching its critical and commercial peak right before Cross's debut album even arrived. In other words, Christopher Cross arrived at the absolute peak of a genre's popularity, swept the Grammys riding that peak, and then watched the entire genre itself begin sliding into cultural irrelevance almost immediately afterward, completely independent of how he looked or whether MTV wanted to play his videos. Ultimately, it was these social and cultural changes that shaped the quieter decades of Cross's musical career far more than any single network's programming decisions. This nuance matters enormously because it does not erase the very real bias that existed in the early MTV era toward conventionally attractive performers. That bias was real, and Christopher himself has spoken about feeling its effects directly. But it also reveals something the simplified internet version of this story tends to flatten entirely. Christopher Cross was not erased by a single villainous network executive making a single cruel decision. He was caught in the much larger, much messier collision of an entire genre falling out of fashion at precisely the same historical moment that a new visual medium was reshaping the entire industry's standards. But understanding the mechanics behind his decline does not erase the personal cost of living through it. So what did this entire experience actually feel like from the inside for the man who had just won every award imaginable and then watched the public turn on him almost overnight? The cruelest thing anyone ever said to his face. Decades after his Grammy sweep, Christopher Cross was still carrying the emotional weight of what happened to him in the years immediately following his historic win. Speaking from his home in Santa Barbara, California, around the time he turned 70, Christopher described an intense backlash that, in his own words, wiped out all the trophies and gold records in his mind. He described his career as having come in like a lion and gone out like a lamb in the lion's mouth. He recounted a conversation with a reporter from Variety, who told him directly that the consensus among music journalists was that there were only two genuinely dark days in the entire history of the Grammy Awards. The day Milli Vanilli won in one of the most infamous music fraud scandals in history, and the day Christopher Cross won. He said he simply could not believe how cruel that comment was. Think about the weight of that comparison for a moment. Milli Vanilli's Grammy was eventually revoked entirely after it was revealed the duo had not actually sung on their own album. One of the most embarrassing fraud scandals the music industry has ever experienced. To have music journalists, decades later, casually placing Christopher Cross's legitimate, fully earned sweep of the Grammy's four biggest categories in the same breath as outright fraud says everything about how thoroughly the cultural narrative around him had curdled. Christopher described feeling in the years following his win that people were simply waiting for him to fail. He said there was this pressure to lay the golden egg every single time, and that demand was, in his own words, an impossible feat to sustain. The very magnitude of his initial success had set an expectation that no follow-up record could realistically meet. And when those follow-up records inevitably failed to match the impossible standard of 4 Grammys and an Oscar, the public and critical response was not sympathy. It was a mockery. Christopher Cross became a purveyor of what critics dismissively called sappy, soulless ear candy. MTV, the very network reshaping the entire industry, would not, according to this account, touch the reigning Grammy king with what was memorably described as a 10-foot moon man, a reference to the channel's iconic astronaut mascot. After 1984, Cross's commercial success faded sharply. His next 2 albums, 1985's Every Turn of the World and 1988's Back of My Mind, failed to produce any top 40 hits and did not reach gold or platinum sales status. The sole bright spot from Every Turn of the World was a song called Charm the Snake, which reached only number 68 on the Billboard Hot 100, a dramatic fall for a man who had recently topped that very same chart. But even in this period of decline, his music found small, unexpected pockets of continued life, revealing something genuinely surprising about how the public's relationship with his catalog evolved over the following decades. So did Christopher Cross simply disappear after the 1980s? Or did something more interesting happen to his career once the initial backlash finally began to fade? What actually happened to him? After the world stopped watching, Christopher Cross never actually stopped making music, and in the decades that followed, his career took on a quieter, more stable shape than the dramatic narrative of total erasure suggests. His track Swept Away found its way into the popular television show Growing Pains, used during a video montage in which Kirk Cameron's character, Mike, fell in love with a local girl while the family vacationed in Hawaii, proof that his music was still finding cultural placement even during what is generally remembered as his commercial wilderness years. He maintained genuine success in Europe and Japan throughout this period, even as his American profile diminished considerably. In 1995, he released an album called Window on the adult contemporary label Rhythm Safari, marking his first American album release in more than 7 years. He continued releasing music steadily through the following decades. His personal life also weathered serious storms during this same stretch of decades. Cross was married to Roseanne Harrison from 1973 to 1982, and later to Jan Bunch from 1988 to 2007. He has 2 children, Madison and Rain. In April 2020, Cross confirmed through his Facebook page that he had tested positive for COVID-19. He later reported on social media that he had temporarily lost the use of his legs as a result of the illness, though his doctors told him he should expect a full recovery, a frightening health scare that added yet another difficult chapter to a career already defined by dramatic highs and brutal lows. What actually happened to Christopher Cross is genuinely more complicated and, in some ways, more human than either the simple villain narrative of MTV deliberately destroying him or the equally simple narrative of a man whose career just naturally faded with changing musical tastes. Do you think MTV's appearance bias was the real reason his career declined? Or was it always going to happen regardless? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.